Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll say first I'll be dividing my time for this debate with the member from Timmins, James Bay. I'm happy to rise here in the House this afternoon in this debate to speak against both the motion and the amendment to that motion. And I was encouraged to hear the speeches earlier this afternoon given by my NDP colleagues that I think really put the proper frame on this debate. Instead of how should we be throwing our military might into the Middle East, or should we bomb or should we not be bombing, the question should really be, how can Canada be a truly positive force in the Middle East and the world? Madam Speaker, I've heard many comments on this issue from many people in my riding, both recently and throughout the long election campaign. And I would have to agree with the member from Elmwood Transcona, who pointed out in his speech that about the clear change in the Liberal stance in this conflict. When I traveled throughout the riding during the campaign, I went to 20 or so all-candidates forums, and it was the Liberal candidate and I that ended up at all those forums. Unfortunately, we didn't really hear much from the Conservative side. But I have to say that I continually heard from the Liberal candidate that Canada should be playing a more positive role in the Middle East, and we should be pulling out the bombers and increasing humanitarian aid. And the audiences in all these 20 locations all agreed with us. Many constituents commented then that this is not our war. And I still hear those comments from my constituents. I've had a couple of messages just in the last week alone from constituents about this, and they weren't even aware of this debate going on. They just wanted me to hear that message. And I'd like to also re-emphasize the comments made earlier by the member from Churchill, Kiwatanuk-Aski, that we seem to be so anxious to put our men and women of the armed forces in harm's way, and yet we continue to ignore the challenges they face when we bring them home. I've talked to many veterans in my riding who despair at the cuts to the services here in Canada, and some have even moved to the quieter parts of my riding since it's the only relief that they can get from their PTSD. And here we are again, Madam Speaker, putting more of our service men and women, tripling the number, into harm's way without a real clear plan of what they are there to do and when we will bring them home. So let's look at the Liberal plan. They want to expand and enlarge our military role in Iraq, with our personnel placed deeper and deeper into the combat. There's no apparent end date to the mission and no clear measures of success. And I remember commenting in the previous debate in the House that we had on an Opposition Day motion on this issue that, I'm reminded of George W. Bush's mission accomplished celebration regarding Iraq. In reality, he was celebrating the birth of ISIS and the destruction of any semblance of a stable Middle East. The Liberal plan blurs the lines between training and combat roles, and while they have recalled the bombers, we'll still be refueling bombers, and we'll be painting targets for them. The irony of this is simply painful, and I must say I'm confused at the lack of clarity in this policy. The human cost is also difficult to assess, but we're told that this mission will cost $264 million. It's interesting that the figure is so precise, considering, as I mentioned before, that the mission has no end date. And both my colleagues from Manitoba have already outlined the clear choices evident in these costs. There are so many positive ways we could be spending those funds here in Canada. Madam Speaker, Canada does have constructive roles to play in fighting ISIS. We should be stopping the arms trade in the region instead of increasing it. And we should first sign the arms trade treaty. It's absolutely unacceptable that Canada has not done this. And we should be cutting off the funding sources for ISIS. And Madam Speaker, we constantly forget the other Canadian fighters in this region, in this conflict. And those are the Canadian fighters that have gone to the Middle East to fight for ISIS. There's nothing in the Liberal plan to increase and expand any de-radicalization program here in Canada. This is something that we desperately need. There are models around the world that we can follow, and we really need to tackle this end of things, because when we talk about the Canadian role in this conflict, we must remember that we can have a more positive effect by battling de-radicalization as well. And yes, we should continue our efforts to resettle refugees from this conflict in our country. And I was disappointed to hear reference to refugees being confused with ISIS fighters and terrorists. This is just simply not the case. There's no evidence of it, of the refugees coming to Canada being involved with this at all. And, I can say that one of the most positive experiences for me as a new Member of Parliament has been the work I've been doing with refugee committees across my riding. There's committees in Penticton. We already have families that have come into Oliver and Osoyoos. There's committees working in Castlegar and New Denver and Nakusp. There's one in Naramata that wants to bring in government-assisted refugees into a church conference center for temporary housing. These people have been working hard. There's hundreds of people in my riding doing this, and there's thousands of people across Canada that are doing this. This is something that Canadians feel great pride in doing, sharing our great country with these people who have suffered so much. So, Madam Speaker, military involvement in this region is fraught with complexities and danger. It's perhaps not surprising that the United Nations and NATO have not sanctioned these actions. And it's time that Canada played a positive role in the Middle East, concentrating on humanitarian aid and diplomacy. Many of our allies, including New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, have all taken this approach. So it's something that we should really follow their lead on. The Conservative debate stresses the effect of the bombing missions. And today I've heard many numbers thrown out there on the number of missions and the number of targets that have been hit, the number of ISIS targets hit. But, too often these bombing missions strike unintended civilian targets. We've all heard of stories of bombs that have struck hospitals. It seems that we hear about this on a very regular basis. This is not only tragic in itself, but only serves as a recruiting tool for ISIS. And, Madam Speaker, this is what ultimately will win this conflict. We must win the hearts and minds of the people that are suffering in the conflict, and we must convince them that ISIS is not the answer to their problems. Bombing missions, no matter how well-intentioned, just won't do that. And so, Madam Speaker, to conclude, I'd like to reiterate that I think that both this motion and the amendment both offer a misguided path forward for Canada and a misguided path for our brave members of our armed forces and for the Middle East as a whole. So thank you.